there, welcome back to Teaching Firsties. My name is Rachel Hull and I help teachers set up and maintain the literacy stations in their classrooms. And one of the ways I do that is right here on YouTube, so don't forget to click like and subscribe so you'll be able to see the videos as they come out weekly. Today we're talking about student groups, in particular how to place your kiddos into their small groups while you pull for your guided reading lessons. So let's talk about one of the biggest mistakes that I made when I first started setting up my literacy centers, and that's how to group your students into their centers. But before we get started, I want to show you what I use to plan all my centers. So let me share my screen. There it is. Okay. This is my Literacy Stations planner, and the link is in the comments or the description of this video, or you can go to literacystations.com/planner to get your own copy of this. It's available on Google Slides, and there's a PDF also, and you can either type in the PDF or you can print it and write on it if you prefer, kind of like an old school. But this is there, and I want to show you the first tab here, which is student groups. You can kind of see how you can plan your groups out. It asks you some helpful questions, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, and then how many groups you decide to want, and you can type right in here for which students you are going to want to move around into your groups. So we'll talk about that here in just a second, but I wanted to let you know that that was free if that's how you decide to plan for your groups. But student grouping was seriously a huge problem for me when I first starting to teach, or first starting to do literacy stations, back in the Stone Ages. I didn't put much thought into working with my groups or grouping them. I kind of just did it by behavior, basically who could work together and who could not. And so I separated, there's my cat again, I separated my kids that way. And so I was more focused on what was going to be at each station, instead of thinking about the most important part, which was my students. Now, I love the book, Dr. Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Dr. Covey says to begin with the end in mind. And that means your students. What do you want them to be able to do after they do a year's worth of centers in your groups? What do you hope to achieve during your small group instruction? So really, what's the purpose of your centers? If it's just to keep the majority of your students occupied while you're pulling for guided reading, then that, my friend, is not time well spent. So the goal should be to review what your students will review what you've already taught them in an independent small group setting, and it needs the materials you give them needs to be familiar to them, but still challenging enough so they're still learning. But I cannot stress this enough. Differentiation is your friend, even if it's hard. So this is the time you need to tailor your activities to your students' individual needs. So now there's a lot of factors that you'll want to keep in mind when you're grouping your students. Do you want to group them by ability? There's a lot of pros and cons to ability grouping. Differentiation is actually easier when you group by ability because each group is at the same level. But ability grouping can also be very detrimental to minority students. Your lower students will just know that they're in a lower group, and that can be detrimental to them. And you're also missing out on an opportunity of different students learning differently from each other. If they've got various levels, they're going to learn from each other as well. So some ability grouping is fine, but a more flexible group is going to benefit your students in the long run. Now, you're going to do this when you're looking at your students' reading levels. And these levels, as you know, will change throughout the year. So revisiting these groups I probably would do it about once a month, just to make sure they're running smoothly, is helpful. If you see issues or if you notice a problem, it could be that your students aren't being challenged enough, or the work is too difficult and you'll need to plan accordingly and perhaps switch your student groups around. So do you remember when I said I grouped my behavior by, when I first started, I only grouped by behavior. And so, it's still important to consider there are just some students who should probably be separated. And I've told this story before, but I had my mom for my teacher as when I was in high school. I had her for pre-calculus, and my best friend Kara was also in my class. So on the first day, she sat, she kind of let us choose where we wanted to sit, and so Kara and I sat by each other, and we talked the whole time. So my mom, of course, had to move us to opposite corners of the room because we kept talking. And I mean, of course, we're going to talk if we are sitting by each other. It doesn't mean we were poor students. It just means that she was my best friend. I was going to talk to her. So separating your Rachels and your Karas is still important. And there's plenty of time in your school day where they can interact, but your literacy stations may not be that setting. You'll also want to look at which students do better working alone. So my son Ethan just prefers to work alone. He focuses better. But his big brother Alex doesn't mind working with a group. So just, once you get to know your kids, you're gonna know which ones work well in a group and which ones it's okay if you give them independent work and they work on their own. So my school was a Title I school, which meant that my students were pulled from my classroom for extra help. And ideally, you'll want to schedule this in so they're pulled from your centers. There she goes. And back, cat fur everywhere. So they're pulled from their centers and back in time for your guided reading group, because it's a headache to try to figure out who goes where, but it's totally possible. So I got really good at moving my schedule around so my Title I students were pulled during their independent time. So they really weren't working alone. They were always working with an aide or the Title I teacher. And then when they came back, it was time for me to pull them into their guided reading class for my groups. So that way they weren't working independently and possibly struggling with the center activities that were too difficult for them. So let me ask you this. How do you plan out your student groups? If you download the Literacy Stations Planner, you can either use the digital version on Google Slides or the PDF. Or like I said, if you're old school and you would like to write things down, you can print it and then jot down your notes about moving your students around. And I've also found that sticky notes work really well. If you know me at all, you'll know that I can't live without these. I'm obsessed with sticky notes. So this was a no-brainer for me too. I sometimes would write my students' names on the smaller sticky notes and then just move them around. If you, if you need to take a big butcher block piece of paper and move them around, or, even just jot down time slots on a piece of paper and just move your sticky notes around. If you're a visual person, that'll work just fine. If you're a spreadsheet person, a Google spreadsheet helps too. You can do the same thing. So block out your guided reading groups, your time slots, and then move your students around, making sure to look for those flexible groups that you can change often. I hope this helps you as you're setting up your literacy centers. Remember to change them up when you need to. If you found this video helpful, please click the like button so that I know the content I'm providing for you is useful in your classroom. I'll see you next time.